The wind whispered through the trees like a forgotten lullaby, rustling pine needles outside the small log cabin that had stood for over 30 years at the edge of White River Forest. Inside, flickering firelight painted warm golden hues across the wooden walls. Thomas Reed, a 67-year-old retired forest ranger, sipped black coffee from his chipped enamel mug, his gaze fixed on the window. It had been a quiet winter so far, too quiet. Years of solitude had taught Thomas to appreciate the silence of the wild. Since losing his wife 6 winters ago, he had learned to live in harmony with the rhythm of the forest, its morning owls, creaking pines, and gentle snowfall. He no longer needed much: a fire, some books, and the memory of better days. But that night, something disrupted the stillness. A sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Thomas froze, mug paused midair. No one knocked out here. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles downriver. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, an old habit, never used unless truly needed. Slowly, he stepped toward the door. Another knock. This one softer. Slower. Almost rhythmic. His heart thudded louder than the wind. He unlatched the bolt and pulled the heavy door open just enough to peek outside. And there it was. A massive shadow hunched in the snow. A bear. A full-grown adult black bear, its dark fur caked with snow and something else, blood. But it wasn't attacking. It wasn't growling. It was looking at him. Its sides heaved, as though it had come a long way. And in its mouth, held carefully by the jaws, was something small, wrapped in fur and soaked with red. A cub? No. A puppy. Thomas stared. Time slowed. The bear gently placed the bundle onto the snow-covered porch, then backed away a few steps, wobbling slightly. Its paw dragged unnaturally. Wounded. Exhausted. But still, calm. Focused. Thomas opened the door wider. What in God's name? The bear gave a low huff. Not a growl, more like a sigh. Then it looked at the pup, looked back at Thomas, and collapsed onto the ground with a muffled grunt. This wasn't a wild attack. This was something else. Something far stranger. As the snow fell silently around them, Thomas dropped to one knee beside the tiny animal, a small golden retriever pup, no older than 6 weeks. Barely breathing. But still alive. He glanced at the bear, now lying motionless but breathing heavily, its dark eyes still fixed on him. And then it clicked. He knew those eyes. His pulse stuttered. Could it be? No, he muttered, shaking his head. But deep down, a memory flickered, one he hadn't touched in years. A rescue. A storm. A half-dead cub trembling in a tree root hollow. His own hands, soaked in rain and blood, had lifted it to safety. Could this be that cub? The one he saved 10 winters ago? The bear exhaled slowly, eyes dimming. Thomas lifted the pup into his arms, heart pounding, past and present colliding in the glow of the porch light. The forest never forgets. And this bear hadn't either. 10 years earlier, the storm had rolled in like an angry god. Thomas had still been an active ranger then, stronger, quicker, and less worn down by grief. The rain had started mid-afternoon, but by sunset, it had become a thunderous downpour. Lightning forked across the sky, splitting ancient trees like kindling. Winds howled through the canyons, and the rivers churned like boiling kettles. A hiker had reported strange noises near Bear Hollow, and Thomas, ever the lone responder, had driven his old forest truck out into the rising storm. He didn't expect to find anything, just the usual echoes of wildlife panicking in the tempest. But then, as he passed a twisted tree near the rocky ridge, he heard it, a cry. High-pitched. Weak. Almost like a baby's wail. He braked hard and leapt out with a flashlight in hand, boots sloshing through the mud and sleet. The beam of light flicked through the trees, dancing on slick bark and falling snow. Then he saw it. A tiny black bear cub, soaked and shivering, wedged into the crook of a fallen pine. Its left leg bent awkwardly. Its side oozed blood where sharp rocks had likely torn through its soft underbelly. It was barely conscious, its body heaving with labored breath. Thomas remembered hesitating, not because he was afraid, but because he knew what this meant. If the mother was nearby, it could be suicide to intervene. But as he scanned the area, he saw no sign of her. No tracks. No calls. Just the wind and that broken cub. He knelt beside it and whispered, "Easy now. I've got you." Using his parka as a makeshift sling, He carefully lifted the cub into his arms. It didn't resist. Too weak to struggle. Its fur was cold and matted, and its eyes flickered in and out of awareness. Thomas carried it to the truck, wrapped it in his coat, and drove back to his cabin with the heater on full blast. That night, while the storm raged on, Thomas made a bed of blankets beside the fire. He cleaned the wounds with iodine, fed the cub sugar water from a syringe, and whispered softly to keep it calm. Every few minutes, it would stir, whimper, and try to move, but always settled again near the warmth of Thomas's hand. He didn't expect it to survive. But it did. He contacted the regional wildlife center the next morning, expecting they'd take the cub. But the storm had blocked all roads for days. So Thomas had no choice but to care for it. Feed it. Nurse it. Protect it. For over a week, it lived beside him in the warmth of the cabin. Every morning, Thomas would wake to find the cub curled against the fireplace, blinking up at him with sleepy eyes. He started calling it Shadow, because it followed him from room to room like one. Shadow grew stronger. He learned to drink from a bowl. To walk without limping. He nuzzled Thomas's hand when he was hungry and fell asleep to the sound of Thomas's low humming. By the time the roads cleared and the wildlife team arrived, the cub was healthy enough to be transferred to a rehabilitation center. When they came to take him, Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't planned on keeping the cub. But now, seeing it look back at him from the truck bed with those wide, soulful eyes, he felt a connection he couldn't explain. A wordless gratitude. A bond not born from domestication, but from survival. "You'll do good out there," Thomas whispered, brushing a hand over Shadow's fur before they closed the gate. "Stay wild." That was the last he ever saw of him. Until now. 10 years later, under the soft snow and frozen twilight, that same bear had returned. And he hadn't come alone. In the days following that mysterious return, Thomas found himself spiraling between disbelief and awe. The massive bear that had saved him was unmistakably Shadow, though much larger now, a living wall of muscle and fur. His deep, intelligent eyes were the same. But it wasn't just the way he looked that convinced Thomas. It was the way he behaved. Shadow didn't act like a wild bear toward him. He didn't growl or flee or show signs of fear. Instead, he stood at a respectful distance from the cabin, observing quietly. Each morning, when Thomas opened the front door, he'd find paw prints in the snow, always the same path leading to the porch and away again, as if checking on him during the night. Some days, Thomas would see him from the kitchen window, sitting calmly beneath the same pine tree near the ridge, watching. Like a sentinel. And he wasn't alone. 2 younger bears began appearing too. A smaller female, lean and cautious, and a curious male who would sometimes wander closer than the others. They were always with Shadow, trailing just behind like pupils shadowing their mentor. Thomas began to suspect the truth. These weren't strangers. They were Shadow's family. Perhaps his cubs. Or perhaps young bears he'd bonded with and led here. Either way, they stuck close to him, and more importantly to Thomas. For the first week, Thomas didn't approach them. He stayed inside, tending to his sprained leg and watching the bears through the frosted windows. He left out berries and smoked fish at the forest's edge, old habits from when he'd cared for Shadow as a cub. Every time he did, by the next morning, the offerings were gone. Then one evening, as Thomas sat bundled on the porch, Shadow approached. He moved slowly, paws crunching lightly in the snow, stopping a few feet from the steps. Their eyes met. Thomas's heart thundered, not with fear, but with something else, recognition. He remembered the weak little cub curled in a ball by the fire, and he saw that soul still living behind the massive brown eyes staring back at him now. "I see you remember me," Thomas said softly, voice cracking. Shadow huffed once, a soft breath in the cold air, then sat down, massive paws splayed in front of him like a loyal dog waiting patiently. After that, it became a routine. Every morning, Shadow would appear with the 2 younger bears in tow. He never stepped onto the porch, never tested boundaries, but always kept vigil nearby. And every night, before the sun dipped behind the ridge, they would disappear silently into the forest shadows. Thomas began talking to him from the porch. Not as one talks to a pet, but as one talks to an old friend. He would speak of the weather, the ache in his leg, the loneliness of aging alone in the wilderness. Sometimes, he'd simply sit in silence, letting the presence of the bear fill the empty spaces left behind by time and memory. And Shadow would just listen. The other two grew bolder over time. The younger male, whom Thomas began to call Rook, would occasionally climb the nearby pine tree, peeking down at the cabin with playful curiosity. The smaller female, Willow, remained shy, often hiding behind Shadow's hulking form. But even they seemed to learn the rhythm of this new, strange harmony between beast and man. Town gossip inevitably picked up. Rangers reported unusual bear behavior near Thomas's cabin, but found no signs of aggression. Hunters steering clear of the area swore they heard watchful footsteps tracking them at a distance. And Thomas, once considered a reclusive eccentric, was now whispered about in awe as the bear whisperer of Cragwood. But for Thomas, it wasn't about fame. It was about connection. After years of solitude and silence, something had returned to his life. Something wild, yes, but something deeply familiar. The kind of bond no human voice could explain. Each night, as snow fell like ash and the wind howled through the trees, Thomas would glance toward the woods, and always, see the faint silhouette of Shadow just beyond the edge of the clearing. Watching, waiting, protecting. And in the quiet of those moments, Thomas began to feel something he hadn't felt in years. He began to feel safe. Thomas rose with the dawn, the way he had every day since Shadow had reappeared. The light outside was pale and blue, the kind that turns snow into silver. He shuffled to the front door, wrapped in his flannel robe, ready to place out the usual smoked fish and berries at the edge of the clearing. But when he opened the door, the world felt wrong. The snow was untouched. No paw prints. No broken twigs. No steaming bear-shaped imprints where Shadow usually sat through the night. He waited. Maybe they were late. He made coffee, tended the fire, and returned to the porch after breakfast. Still no sign. The forest stood still, thick with silence. No birdsong. No movement. No bears. That entire day, Thomas kept watch, eyes sweeping from the tree-line to the ridges above, hoping for the familiar outline of his massive friend or the flick of a younger cub's ears behind a tree. But dusk came and went, and the clearing remained empty. The next morning was the same. Then a third. Shadow, Rook, and Willow had vanished. Thomas didn't panic at first. Bears were wild animals, after all. Maybe they had gone to forage deeper into the mountains, or perhaps some seasonal instinct had drawn them elsewhere temporarily. He told himself that repeatedly, until the 6th day. By then, the worry had sunk its claws deep. Thomas ventured beyond the clearing for the first time in months. His ankle was still healing, and the snow made walking difficult, but he pressed on, calling softly into the forest as he went. Shadow? Rook? Willow? Nothing but wind answered. He searched for tracks, any sign that the trio had passed through, but the weak snowfall had buried everything. The woods felt colder now. Emptier. The deep, living presence he'd felt ever since their return was suddenly, jarringly absent. On the 7th day, Thomas lit a lantern and placed it by the edge of the forest at night. A signal. A welcome. A silent prayer. But the light burned alone until dawn. He tried to convince himself not to feel abandoned. Not to slip into the kind of loneliness that had once haunted his nights before Shadow ever came back. "They're wild animals," he muttered to himself one evening, feeding logs into the fireplace. "They don't owe you anything, Thomas." But his heart didn't believe it. This felt different. This wasn't the natural wandering of wildlife. This was sudden. This was wrong. Then came the dream. On the 10th night, Thomas fell asleep in his armchair by the fire and dreamed of a rushing river, icy and raging. He saw Rook struggling in the current, Willow howling from the bank. Then, Shadow appeared atop a nearby rock, roaring into the storm. The roar turned into a whisper. "Help!" Thomas woke with a jolt. Sweat dampened his collar. The fire had burned low, and his mug of tea was ice cold. It was just a dream, he told himself. Except it hadn't felt like one. The next morning, he called the ranger station. Luke Carson, a young ranger who'd heard the rumors of the bear man, arrived that afternoon. Thomas explained everything: how Shadow had returned, how he stayed for weeks, how the cubs had grown closer, and how one day, they all just disappeared. Luke didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded slowly. "We've actually had reports of strange movement near the eastern ridge. Hunters saying something's scaring off wildlife. Bears howling. That's not normal. Can you take me there?" Thomas asked, gripping his cane tightly. Luke hesitated. "It's a rough hike. You sure you're up for it?" Thomas's eyes burned with resolve. "If something happened to them, I need to know." They made plans to leave at first light. That night, Thomas stood in the clearing once more, lantern in hand, eyes on the tree-line. The wind whispered through the pines like a voice just out of reach. He whispered back, "Hold on, Shadow. I'm coming." The forest east of Thomas's cabin had always felt ancient, dense, brooding, and alive with secrets. By sunrise, Thomas and Ranger Luke were hiking along narrow deer trails through frost-covered underbrush. The air was biting, but Thomas pressed forward, leaning on his cane, each step driven by worry and something deeper, connection. They were family, he finally said, breaking the silence. Not pets. Not just animals. Family. Luke gave a solemn nod. Bears can form bonds, real ones. Especially when they remember who helped them survive. After nearly 2 hours of slow trekking, Luke stopped, raising a hand. "Do you smell that?" Thomas sniffed the cold air. A sharp metallic tang lingered, unnatural and out of place. "Gunpowder," Luke said grimly. They followed the scent until they stumbled upon the remains of a torn-up campsite. There were empty bullet casings scattered in the snow, a burnt-out fire pit, and deep claw marks on a nearby pine. "Poachers," Luke muttered, his voice tight with anger. "Illegals. They've been sneaking onto protected lands for months." Thomas's chest tightened. "You think?" Shadow tried to stop them. "Wouldn't be the first time a bear confronted humans near a kill zone," Luke said. He knelt by the claw marks, then pointed to paw prints partially filled with snow. "These are fresh. And they're big." Thomas dropped to one knee and placed his hand next to one of the prints. It was the size of a dinner plate. "Shadow. He was here. Recently. And look here," Luke added, standing up and pointing to the distance. "Those tracks head toward the ravine." They followed the trail until the trees parted, revealing a narrow river gorge cutting deep into the rock. At the bottom, ice crusted the edges of the flowing water, and the opposite ridge rose steep and sheer. From that distance, Thomas spotted a dark figure lying near the riverbank, barely visible, unmoving. His heart clenched. "Is that?" Luke raised binoculars. "Bear. A big one. Hurt. Looks like its legs caught between boulders." Without hesitation, Thomas started climbing down the icy slope. "Thomas. Wait." Luke shouted, but the old man didn't stop. Every movement sent pain shooting through Thomas's healing ankle, but he pushed on, his breath misting with every grunt. As he neared the bottom, the shape became clearer and familiar. Shadow. The massive bear lay wedged between rocks, breathing shallowly, his right hind leg twisted awkwardly. Blood stained the snow around him. "Shadow," Thomas whispered, dropping to his knees beside the bear. The bear opened one eye, golden and glassy. Recognition flickered. A low groan rumbled from his chest. "You stayed behind to protect them, didn't you?" Thomas choked. "You fought for them." Luke finally caught up, breathless and stunned. "We need help. I'll call it in." While Luke radioed for backup, Thomas stroked the bear's thick fur. It was matted and dirty, but warm. Alive. "Where are the cubs, boy?" Thomas murmured. "Where's Rook? Where's Willow?" As if in answer, a soft sound echoed from across the ravine. A whimper. They turned. Atop a distant ledge stood 2 small figures, Rook and Willow. The cubs, alive and alert, watching anxiously. But they didn't come down. They were stranded. They must have gotten separated during the attack, Luke realized. Shadow must have drawn the poachers away, led them here, and fell in the process. Thomas looked down at the great bear beside him, tears stinging his eyes. "You saved them again," he whispered. "You risked everything." Rescue teams arrived an hour later, wildlife medics, volunteers, and a team from the regional sanctuary. They sedated Shadow carefully and used winches to lift him from the ravine. The cubs were coaxed down the ridge with gentle calls, and both ran straight to their injured guardian, circling nervously. When Shadow was finally lifted onto a snowmobile sled, Rook and Willow refused to be left behind. They followed alongside, never more than a few feet from his side. As the caravan returned through the forest, Thomas rode beside Shadow in silence. He reached out and placed a hand on the bear's side, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of life beneath the thick fur. "You held on," he said softly. "Now it's my turn." Spring arrived slowly in the mountains that year, melting the last remnants of snow into quiet streams and muddy trails. Weeks had passed since the rescue. Shadow had undergone surgery at the regional wildlife sanctuary. His leg, though badly broken, was saved. He was healing, slowly but surely. And so were the cubs, Rook and Willow, who never once left their guardian's side. Thomas visited often, sometimes with Ranger Luke, sometimes alone. Each visit filled him with a mixture of joy and heartache. He'd press his hand against the glass of Shadow's observation enclosure and talk to him. "They say you're recovering faster than they expected." "Figures. You've always been a fighter." Shadow would lift his great head, eyes locking with Thomas's, and give the softest grunt, an acknowledgement, a greeting, a memory. As the weeks stretched into months, the sanctuary staff made a decision: Shadow would not be released. His injury would limit him in the wild, making survival unlikely. But Rook and Willow? They would have a second chance. The cubs, now strong and healthy, had been trained for reintroduction. They developed the foraging and survival instincts they needed. It was time. Thomas stood by the release gate that morning, his hand resting on Shadow's thick neck. "They'll be all right," he said softly. "You raised them right." Shadow huffed again, his gaze distant but calm. The gate opened, and the cubs bounded out, first hesitant, then determined, into the forest beyond. They paused once at the tree line, turning back to look at the old man and their silent guardian. Rook gave a low grunt. Willow tilted her head. Then they vanished into the wild. Shadow remained still for a long moment, then laid down beside the fence, his eyes resting on the forest where the cubs had gone. "They'll come back," Thomas whispered, as much to himself as to the bear. Summer brought brightness back to Thomas's world. He planted a new patch of sunflowers behind the cabin and restored the old wooden swing Marion used to sit on. His ankle had finally healed, but the cane stayed. It reminded him of the journey, of endurance. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with shades of gold and rose, Thomas sat on the porch with a book in hand. A breeze carried the scent of pine and wild honeysuckle. The forest beyond his garden stood tall and watchful. Then he heard it. A branch cracking. Not alarming, deliberate. He looked up. And froze. There, just beyond the tree-line, stood Shadow. He was thinner than before, slower perhaps, but upright and proud. His leg had healed enough to let him walk. And he had made the journey. Thomas stood. Slowly. Heart pounding. "You came back," he whispered. Behind Shadow, two smaller shapes emerged, Rook and Willow, now nearly full-grown, walking confidently at their guardian's side. It was a quiet procession. No roaring, no drama. Just presence. Shadow stopped a few paces from the porch. Rook wandered over to the edge of the garden, sniffing the sunflowers. Willow lay down in the soft grass, eyes half closed. Thomas stepped down from the porch. Carefully. Slowly. He stopped a few feet from Shadow and met his gaze. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad you are." Shadow gave one of his deep, familiar grunts, the sound Thomas had heard when Shadow was just a cub, curled in the laundry room on that first frozen night. For a few perfect minutes, man and bear stood in stillness, the sun casting warm light between them. Then, as if on cue, Shadow turned and began walking back into the trees. Rook and Willow followed, stopping once to glance back. Thomas raised a hand in farewell. "You'll always have a place here," he said, voice steady. "Any time." From that night on, Thomas began to see signs. Large paw prints by the edge of the river. Sunflowers gently bent, never eaten, just touched. A trail of smoothed grass beneath the trees, as though something large had passed through but didn't want to be seen. And once, just once, he found a fresh trout laid on his porch. A gift. A gesture. A thank you. He never saw Shadow up close again. But he knew the bear was out there. Watching. Protecting. As summer turned to fall, Thomas finally installed a motion-triggered camera near the garden, not to spy, but to remember. The footage it captured was grainy, but clear enough. 3 bears, one old, 2 younger, passing silently beneath the moonlight, pausing briefly by the flowers. Thomas saved that clip on his computer and titled it, Family. In the final chapter of his life, Thomas no longer felt alone. Not truly. Because out there, in the forest he once feared and later loved, were 3 lives forever entwined with his own. A bond not born of blood, but of compassion, sacrifice, and trust. And sometimes at night, when the wind rustled the trees just right, he swore he could hear soft huffs and heavy footsteps beyond the darkness, echoes of the bears who once knocked on his cabin door, and never truly left.